Why does my marriage end up like this? That was the very first thought of Christina when she saw the strange man coming out of the bathroom. She was never that kind of person who believed that when one door shuts, another opens till she met him. Christina felt that there was something wrong with her marriage. Her husband had courted her passionately and sincerely back then. He even couldn't wait to marry her when she just completed her undergraduate studies. She was only 21 at that time. She couldn't understand why it turned out to be a loveless and sexless marriage. They slept in the same bed, but he never had sex with her. However, after that night, everything changed. That night, she had been led to a high-end hotel by her husband. She thought her 3-year asexual marriage had finally come to an end. But she didn't expect that it was all a plot by her beloved husband. She lay on her side, on a big white bed, sore and fragile. She was still a little uncomfortable, and her memory was vague. But she knew that her husband had taken her V-card. Although he was not gentle, she still felt sweet and happy. After getting married for 3 years, they finally made love. But when she looked at the handsome man in the bathrobe, who was not the husband she had known for 3 years, she panicked. Before Christina could say anything, the man was the first to say, "Why are you still here?" His cold voice was filled with discontent. The voice was low, but manly, attracting her like a magnet. Christina was completely shocked and looked at the strange man in front of her in disbelief. "Who are you?" She didn't know him. He was a complete stranger to her. "Who the hell are you? Why are you here?" She screamed in fear. "Corey brought me here, and this is our suite. How could this strange man be here? Where is Corey?" Christina grabbed the blanket in panic and quickly got up from the bed. She looked vigilantly at the man, who was standing by the bed. "How did you get in? Where is my husband? Where is he?" The man's features were deep and cold, and he was tall and handsome. He looked impatient. Suddenly he stepped forward, stretched out his arm, and pulled Christina up. The blanket wrapped on her body was then slipped. "What do you want?" His voice was cold, and a hint of contempt rose from the corners of his lips. He believed that Christina was just putting on an act, like countless gold diggers before who wanted to climb into his bed. But the difference this time was that this woman succeeded. At this thought, his gaze towards Christina grew colder. "You bastard! Let go of me! I am going to sue you for rape!" Christina was frightened by his gaze. She tried to break free from the man's grip, but he didn't give her a chance at all. Before she could react, she was pressed against the wall. The man leaned forward, his burning chest close to her. "Rape. I remember last night it was you who initiated it," the man sneered. Christina's face immediately flushed with embarrassment. She had thought it was her husband Corey last night. So in order to make their first time more memorable, she had watched a lot of adult films. But she never expected that the person in the room wasn't her husband Corey at all, but this stranger in front of her. Why did everything become like this? Since you don't remember, I don't mind helping you recall it again. The man's icy words fell. The very next moment, Christina fell heavily on the bed. She came back to her senses, struggled against his chest, which however made the man hornier. Christina felt the man's eagerness, and she was frightened. All her struggles were futile, which made her anxious and angry. She made up her mind and suddenly raised her right hand and put it around the man's neck. Christina tilted her head and took the initiative to deepen the passionate kiss. The man was surprised by her initiative, and he was in a daze, so Christina grasped the opportunity to take a bite at the tip of the man's tongue. The sting made him immediately release her in anger. Christina was panicked, but she took the opportunity to give the man a shove. She quickly got up from the bed and rushed to the door. She pulled off a random coat hanging at the door and ran out quickly. She could vaguely hear the man roaring at his bodyguard. "Find out who sent that woman to me." Christina was anxious. After rushing out of the hotel, she stood by the side barefoot of the road. She wasn't even wearing her underwear, which made her feel insecure. Wrapped tightly in the coat, she shrank and looked around nervously. At this moment, a taxi came. Christina reached into the pocket and found a black LV wallet. She quickly opened the wallet and found that there were 5 credit cards in it, but no cash. Christina was sure that the man must be rich and noble. "I don't have any cash. Take the pocket watch here. Please drive me to Aston Villa of the Hampton family in the west of the city." She got in the taxi. She had found an exquisitely crafted gold pocket watch from the man's black wallet. She stuffed it into the driver's hand, ignoring the driver's weird look. Go. Sitting in the car, Christina began to recall what had happened. She learned from the man's words that the man thought she was a prostitute. But why did everything become like this? Before Christina figured it out, her phone suddenly received a message. "You have occupied the position of Mrs. Hampton for 3 years. That is mine. Now it is time for you to leave." It was a text message from an unknown number. When she dialed back, it kept showing no answer. "Who is this?" "I have known Corey since college. I am not a mistress." What does this message mean? Finally, the car stopped in front of Aston's mansion, and Christina immediately ran towards the entrance. Suddenly, 2 maids immediately stepped forward to stop her, with panic on their faces. "Ma'am, it is so late. We thought you'd better stay at the downtown apartment." Seeing their expressions, Christina knew that something was wrong. Ignoring them, she strode straight to the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. She had just gone upstairs when she heard the groan from a man and a woman, which were both familiar to her. Christina bit her lips, held her breath, and held the doorknob with a trembling hand. The door opened. Christina's face turned pale. The room was littered with clothes, and the man and the woman were intertwined on the bed. What made her even more devastated was that the woman who had an affair with her husband turned out to be her stepmother's sister. "Carrie, what is wrong with them? They only like to steal other people's husbands." "Corey," Carrie moaned in a hoarse voice. Christina looked at the scene in front of her, and her stomach felt like she had swallowed 1,000 flies. Carrie immediately noticed Christina at the door, but she didn't feel any shame. On the contrary, her voice grew louder. "Corey, when are you going to divorce your wife?" With that, Carrier provocatively glanced at Christina once again, while Corey remained absorbed in the woman's body, completely oblivious to Christina's presence at the door. "After tonight, I got someone to take those pictures of her. Even if my mother liked her, she wouldn't tolerate Christina falling into disrepute." Corey lowered his head. In a hoarse voice he said, "Babe, I love you. I will definitely divorce Christina." Christina's mind exploded. She bit her lips so hard to suppress her anger that it was bleeding. She couldn't believe that her husband would betray her in this way. She could accept divorce, but why couldn't he just be honest about not having feelings for her? Instead, he wanted to destroy her, even disregarding the reputation of his own family. She didn't know what she had done wrong. How could her husband Corey hate her so much? Christina couldn't control her trembling anymore, but she confirmed the truth, that it was indeed her husband who had sent her into the bed of that stranger. She had always wanted to maintain her dignity, but talking about dignity in front of these 2 venomous snakes was absurd in itself. Christina couldn't hold back any longer. She wiped away her tears and barged in, swiftly giving Corey a slap. "Corey, you bastard!" Christina's sudden voice shocked the man on the bed. Corey looked at the door, and a flash of surprise and guilt in his eyes when he saw Christina. but he put on a cold face again instantly. "Get out of here! You two should get out. Not me." Christina's chest heaved up and down in anger, shouting at the bed. "Christina, be smart, get a divorce and leave. Otherwise I'll show everyone the sexy pictures of you with a man tonight. I don't think you can still stay in the Hampton family. You don't deserve it." The crack in Christina's heart grew larger and larger. She couldn't reconcile this despicable man with the gentleman she remembered. Looking at his twisted face now, she suddenly felt that all her years of love had turned into a joke. She couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't even bear to look at this disgusting man for a second. She would divorce. She didn't want such a meaningless and disgusting marriage. She wiped away the teardrop from the corner of her eyes and walked out of the room, her messy footsteps revealing her embarrassment and disappointment. Suddenly, there was a childish cry. A 3-year-old girl crashed into Christina at the door, and the girl fell to the floor. Christina lowered her head in a daze and saw the girl in front of her. "Sweetheart." Carrie rushed out of the room. She stood in front of the girl and looked at Christina warily. "Vent your anger on me. Don't bully my daughter." "Daughter?" Christina frowned. Carrie had a daughter, yet she still chose to have an affair with her husband. Wasn't she worried about the impact of her actions on her daughter? Christina looked at the little girl and noticed her trembling gaze as if she had made a grave mistake. Christina couldn't help but feel sympathy towards her. She wanted to go over and comfort her. For some reason, she had a natural fondness for the little girl. But before she could act, Carrie rudely pulled the girl towards her. "I know what you are thinking, but the fact is, this is mine and Corey's daughter." Carrie laughed. "What? This is Corey's daughter. That meant Corey had been cheating on her since they got married." Christina thought about the images of her and Corey lying in bed together. Even though Corey hadn't touched her, the nauseating feeling in her stomach grew stronger. "You must agree to the divorce. My daughter, Corey, and I are the real family." "You are nothing," Carrie said triumphantly. As Christina looked at Carrie with a victorious posture, she laughed. She thought it would anger her, but the truth was, she just wanted to get out of there and rid herself of these two disgusting women. "That is fine. I hope you two are bound together like shit and flies forever. You, the fly. Finally have Corey, this pile of shit. Who do you think you are calling a fly?" Carrie angrily raised her arm, wanting to slap Christina, but Christina had been learning Taekwondo, and she immediately slapped Carrie back. "Aren't you? You and your sister are nothing but filthy flies in the toilet. Your sister had hooked up with my father, and you hook up with my husband. Should I call you slut sisters or mistress sisters?" Christina's chest was heaving, and the thought of the past made her furious, especially when she thought about her mother committing suicide in prison because of her father's infidelity. And now this whore in front of her, just as shameless as her sister, happily living in this world while clinging to someone else's husband. She could no longer control her anger, but just as she was about to teach this bitch another lesson, Corey suddenly appeared and forcefully pushed her against the wall. Her head hit the wall hard. "Christina, how dare you to hit her?" Corey had changed his robe, and he rushed out to protect Carrie. Christina didn't feel the pain. Her inner world had turned into ruins. She thought other men would be different from her bastard father. But in reality, all men in the world were bastards. It was absurd to shed tears for them in this world. She touched the swollen lump on her forehead. She knew that pain, like the swelling on her head, would eventually disappear. But the most important thing was not to forget the people who had hurt her, just like she shouldn't forget how cruelly her father had treated her mother. Even when he heard of her mother's death, his face only showed impatience. When the news came from the prison, he was enjoying a delicious sandwich, and his indifferent lips uttered only one word. Trouble. She never returned to the Dickens family. She gave up her status as the daughter of a billionaire. She met Corey, and he passionately pursued the ordinary her. She immediately got lost in the halo of happiness, forgetting her father's atrocities. She accepted Corey's proposal. She should harshly condemn herself for it. It was she who walked into the marriage with beautiful illusions. And now, it was time to end everything. Amidst the astonished gazes of everyone, she walked out. In the early winter morning, the night was quiet and bone-chillingly cold. Christina walked on the street, hugging her knees, trying to hold back her tears. Suddenly, a car with bright headlights came towards her. Before she could dodge, she was hit by the force of the car. "Sir, I hit someone." The driver got out of the car, and after confirming that the woman on the ground had fainted, immediately reported fearfully to the suited man in the back seat. The suited man was none other than Patrick. He had received a call from his grandfather, who sounded very anxious. He had to rush back home. The only person he cared about was his grandfather. On his first night back from the United States, he didn't go home but chose to stay in a hotel. He just didn't want to face his grandfather's repeated pressure to get married. But what was worse, the hotel had mistakenly given him the wrong room. This allowed the woman the opportunity to enter his room. Perhaps it had been too long since he last had sex, but he was unexpectedly aroused by her and unhesitatingly possessed her. But the ridiculous thing was that this woman had learned to act. She claimed it was unintentional, and maybe he would have believed her if she hadn't taken his wallet. He swore that if he found her again, he would kill her. "Sir, how should we handle this?" The driver looked at Patrick, whose face was gradually turning dark, and his tongue uncontrollably trembled. Patrick wanted to get out of the car to check on the woman's condition, but his phone rang again. He bet that if he didn't go back now, his grandfather would have a heart attack and die. He gave the driver a piercing gaze. "I'll take a taxi back. You get the woman to the hospital as quickly as possible and bear all the medical expenses." As soon as the driver understood, he immediately took the woman to the hospital. Just as Patrick walked into the foyer of the mansion, a book narrowly missed hitting his face. It was thrown by his grandfather. "Patrick, you still know to come back." In the middle of the wide sofa in the living room sat an old man with a solemn face. He was in a black suit embroidered with gold thread. Holding a walking stick, he was shouting angrily at his grandson. Patrick looked helplessly at his grandfather's excited expression. His grandfather had high blood pressure, and he didn't want to further stimulate him. He took the initiative to sit down and ask his grandfather why he was so urgent. "Go to Gordon Hotel for a blind date at 7 tomorrow night," his grandfather said angrily. Patrick initially wanted to refuse, but he knew that if he did, he wouldn't be able to rest properly today. He pretended to agree and then used the excuse of being very tired to go straight to his bedroom on the second floor. "Look what he is like now." His grandfather couldn't help but complain from behind. "Old master, young master has just returned from the United States. Don't force him to go on a blind date in such a hurry." The old butler couldn't help laughing and advised. Mr. Hopkins stared at him. "How can I not be in a hurry? I have only one grandson. He is almost 30 years old but doesn't even have a girlfriend. When will he give me a great-grandson? Young master has never fancied women that much since childhood." The old butler also looked worried. "Old master, we will hold a party next month, and there must be many ladies coming. Then young master can pick one he likes." When Mr. Hopkins thought of the party, he raised his brows slightly and told in an old and stern voice, "Make it grand and tell them, any girl who is able to make him settle down, I will recognize her as the granddaughter-in-law of the Hopkins family, no matter what her family background is." When Christina woke up in the hospital, a day had already passed. She had no intention of finding the owner of the car that hit her, because it was her own carelessness that led her to walk onto the busy road, and the person had already paid for her medical expenses. Confirming that she was not injured, She took a taxi straight back to her pre-marriage small apartment. In the span of a month, even though the festive atmosphere of Christmas filled the air outside, no one contacted her. Christina wagered that even if she died in the apartment, it would probably take until spring for the stench to be noticed by the apartment management. Ever since she married Corey, she had lost contact with her previous friends. She needed to spend the whole day studying Corey's preferences and ensuring that he would see her every moment he returned home. So even though she disappeared from the social scene, her phone remained quiet as if it were turned off. When she ran to the coffee machine in her pajamas from a week ago, wanting to make herself a cup of coffee, she found that the coffee beans had run out. She had no choice but to drive to the supermarket. However, after searching through all her pockets, she discovered that her driver's license and ID had disappeared. Suddenly, she remembered the night she had spent in the hotel with that strange man, and she had left in a hurry and left behind her clothes and bag, in which there were her driving license and ID card. Damn it! She had no choice but to go to the nearest Starbucks. However, as she returned to her table after placing her order, Corey's disgusting face appeared in front of her again. Stop pretending to be miserable. Christina, what kind of trick did you play to make my mother disapprove of our divorce? Can you please let me go? I don't want to do anything with such a shameless woman. When Christina heard the voice, a hint of pain flashed across her eyes. She pursed her lips, raised her head, and pretended to be strong. Then she turned around and strode straight past him. She didn't want to engage in meaningless arguments with him, especially with the curious gazes of the people in the coffee shop, fixated on them. Right now, all she wanted was to leave. Corey was surprised. Seeing her ignore him like this, he felt angry and reached out to grab her arm. Let go of me. Christina threw his hand away in disgust. Corey got even more fretful at the sight of her disgust for him and sneered, Christina, don't flatter yourself and don't ever think that I am here to coax you. It is just that my mom asked you to go to the party held by the Hopkins family. I am not interested. Christina didn't feel well right now and was having a splitting headache. For more than a month, Christina had wanted to get a divorce, but was rejected by Lori, who only told her not to make a fuss, while Corey also listened to his mother and didn't dare to mention the divorce again. Lori is her mother-in-law, who has been steadfastly supportive of her, despite Corey's cold treatment. The reason she hasn't received any calls from Lori in a month is because she had already blocked her. She had made up her mind to divorce and didn't want to communicate with Lori about the situation with Corey. Don't waste my time. You'd better stay in the corner. You were originally unqualified to go to the party. Then, you shouldn't have come today. Christina wished she could pour the hot coffee over his head, but it was too cold and she didn't want to waste it on him. Corey remembered his mother's warning. His mother insisted that Christina accompany him to the Hopkins family banquet. If he wanted to secure his inheritance from the Hopkins family, he had to follow Lori's instructions. He knew his grandfather already had reservations about Patrick's refusal to get married, so he couldn't let any scandals reach his grandfather's ears. He needed to earn his grandfather's trust more than Patrick did, so he had to attend the banquet with Christina. He proposed a condition. Christina, if you agree to accompany me to the banquet, I will agree to the divorce. Deal, Christina replied without looking at him and quickly left the coffee shop. In the hall of the Hopkins family's mansion, the party was held in a splendid and magnificent way. The 8-meter-long European crystal chandelier was shining above. It felt like a grand blind date, with stunning beauties in full makeup everywhere. They talked, laughed, and toasted, looking very excited. Christina felt depressed and unwell, so she walked towards a quiet corner. However, at this moment, a pair of piercing eyes were sticking to her, but she knew nothing of it. Patrick, do you know that woman? Two charming men were leaning against the railing on the second floor. and one of them asked curiously. Patrick gazed in Christina's direction, with a grim face, not answering. Christina felt someone was looking at her intensely. Christina felt like she was being stalked by a wolf from behind. She shivered, but when she looked towards the direction of the second floor, no one was looking at her. She suspected it was just her imagination. Perhaps standing in the drafty spot had caused her to have a false perception. She knew Corey's purpose for bringing her here today. The banquet was to welcome back the eldest grandson of the Hopkins family, and as Corey's wife she had to attend as a family member. The Hopkins and Hampton families valued family unity the most, so Corey wouldn't dare to bring Carrie along, but she was wrong. Just as she was about to find a warmer spot, a sharp voice stopped her. What a coincidence! Christina, Carrie looked at her. Christina gritted her teeth and sneered. Mistress, how dare you come here? Carrie held a 3-year-old girl in her right hand and stared at her with a sinister gaze. Christina, who do you think you are? You will be kicked out of the Hampton family very soon. If you think you could be Mrs. Hampton forever, then you are daydreaming. With that, Carrie laughed out loud. Christina, seriously. Poor you. Your husband sent you to another man's bed so he could divorce you. How did you feel? Is it good? Shut up. When Christina heard her words, she lost control and screamed. Carrie laughed even more arrogantly. Corey told me that you were married for 3 years, but he didn't even want to touch you. Christina, that is really pathetic. Now everyone in the circle know that you are a hen who can't lay eggs. Corey brought me and my daughter to the Hopkins family's party today. He said he wanted to introduce me and my daughter to the rich and famous businessmen. I advise you to get out of here. I felt disgusting seeing you here. Well done, Carrie. No, I should call you Mistress. After all, I believe that you really love to be a mistress. Christina gritted her teeth angrily and glared at Carrie. By the way, I think you've got it all wrong, Christina said. Wrong about what? Carrie asked. I want a divorce, but Corey begged me not to divorce him. I bet you secretly stole the invitation to this banquet to come here. If Corey's mother finds out you are here, do you think she would kick you out? Christina looked at Carrie's panicked expression and knew she was right. Corey couldn't be so bold. Christina looked at the little girl beside Carrie. Her eyes were always filled with fear. And most importantly, she was nothing like Carrie. When her mother was protesting, the little girl nervously watched Christina. Christina sighed. She couldn't let Carrie continue to embarrass herself in front of the little girl. But as she was about to leave, Carrie suddenly raised her hand and viciously slapped the little girl. The girl's face turned red and swollen, and her small body staggered backward and fell down. The girl bumped into the foot of the table behind her, and a few of the buffet porcelain plates on the table fell to the ground, shattering and splattering. Blood immediately flowed out from the girl's arms. The child cried out in pain. Christina was stunned when she saw this. Carrie hit her own daughter. The next second, Carrie shouted, "Don't hit my daughter. Please let us go. The child is innocent. Don't hit her." Carrie's high-pitched voice quickly attracted the attention of the people around them. Carrie held the bleeding girl in her arms and cried with a grievance. Christina, Corey and I really loved each other years ago. You forced me to go abroad. I know I shouldn't have come back, but my daughter wanted to see her father. I didn't dare to ask you to give Corey back to me. Don't hurt us. Christina could not believe that Carrie had abused the child in order to frame her. I didn't touch her. She hit her own daughter to frame me. Everyone around her was curious and Christina explained herself nervously. But before she could finish her sentence, a figure on the right rushed over. Christina, what the f*** did you do? Corey broke through the crowd and gave Christina a hard push. Before she realized it, she fell straight down. Her brain was blank. She was dizzy, She looked up, her eyes blurry, and saw Corey standing in front of Carrie and protecting her. This Christina has been married to Corey for 3 years and hasn't been pregnant. She can't bear that someone had a child before her, so she actually hit that girl. She is too vicious, the guests around whispered. Christina bit her lip tightly and tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to hold back her grievances. She could not cry. She could never cry. Her arms and palms were pierced with broken porcelain, and her face was pale with pain. A large blood vessel was punctured by a broken piece of porcelain on her arm, and bright red blood flowed down her fair arm. The smell of blood drifted away, and soon the clean marble was filled with a pool of dark red. It was shocking and scary. Kick her out! Corey looked at her without any pity, and there were only hatred and disgust in his eyes, and ordered the servants. Soon a man appeared behind Christina and helped her. "Let me go. Don't touch me." But the grip on her did not loosen, but tightened. "You bit me, but you ran away." A deep, clear male voice sounded in her ear. Christina found the voice familiar. She was pale due to the loss of blood. She looked back at the man in a blurred vision. The man was half squatting behind her. His sword brows were hidden behind his short black hair and his nose and the outline of the Eurasian hybrid made him handsome and delicate. This man was born noble and aloof. Just a glance at him left a deep impression on others. Of course, Christina recognized him. It was him, that bastard, who slept with me. "Don't touch me." Christina struggled and shouted stubbornly, unwilling to let him touch her. The loss of blood made her pale, and there were whispers of discussion all around her. The people here were laughing at and cursing her but defending Carrie and her daughter. "I didn't hit the little girl." She was like being isolated by the whole world. Desperately and helplessly, she was pushing the man, unwilling to give in. Go away!" Christina struggled and shouted, but all of a sudden, she passed out. Patrick saw her suddenly close her eyes. Only then did he notice that her body was so hot, and even though he shook her, she had no reaction. Anxiety appeared on his cold and indifferent face, and he immediately picked her up. Christina was weak, and her eyes were tightly closed, and she was drawn to sleep. Tina. She even heard someone call her by her nickname anxiously in her dream. When her mother was alive, she often called her Tina. She was once the apple of the eye of the Dickens family, but when she was 17, her father, Donald, brought home his mistress. After her mother died, she broke up with her father. After leaving the Dickens family, she lived a life of poverty and frugality. No one knew that she was the daughter of the richest man in the neighboring city. Marrying Corey, she never coveted his family's money, but just wanted a happy family. But this marriage was a complete tragedy to her. Christina struggled in pain on the bed. It seemed that she was having a nightmare. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and gasped for air, sweat oozing from her forehead. She looked at the white ceiling above her head in a daze. She regained her senses and smelled of disinfectant at the tip of her nose. She knew she was now in a hospital. "Miss Dickens, you are awake." A nurse stood by the bed and greeted her with a smile after seeing her wake up. Christina wiped the cold sweat off her forehead, took a deep breath and looked at the nurse. What is wrong with me?" Her body was still very weak and her memory was messy. She remembered she had quarreled with Carrie, then she was pushed by Corey and fell down, and there was blood. And that man. The nurse carefully changed the injection, and she whispered in a respectful tone, "Miss Dickens, you are pregnant." "What?" Christina was startled. She thought she was hearing her wrong. The nurse smiled with blessing. "Congratulations, Miss Dickens. You've been pregnant for 6 weeks." Christina's face was completely devoid of joy. Instead, there was a look of shock and trepidation. "I am pregnant." Christina subconsciously stroked her flat abdomen with her right hand. With a shocked expression, she got up from the bed excitedly. How could I be pregnant? How could I get pregnant?" Christina remembered that after that day, she had taken emergency contraception. But to her surprise, it didn't work. Suddenly, Corey's angry voice came over. "Mom, why did you ask me to be here? I don't want to see her. Did you hear about her great behaviors? She hit my Jasmine? Who is your own granddaughter? How dare you mention this?" Lori's face darkened with anger. "Corey, I've told you before. I don't care how you mess around with them, but how dare you brought them over to the Hopkins family's party? Now that Christina is pregnant, you should be nice to her. You should pray that your grandfather won't know you cheating. Go in and see her. Christina is pregnant." Corey was stunned. Then, his face grew grim, and he stepped forward and urged, "Mom, what did you just say? Christina is pregnant. How could she be pregnant? I've never slept with her," he yelled angrily. Lori looked shocked. "You've been married for 3 years. How could you? Never touched her. So, now that Christina was pregnant, the child is mine." The cold voice, word by word, followed by footsteps, came slowly from the other end of the corridor. In the corridor of the VIP floor of the hospital, a group of people came quickly, even Mr. Hopkins. At this moment, the entire corridor fell silent. Lori and the others were speechless in shock, and that cold voice kept ringing. "The child is mine." It was Patrick. Everyone looked at Patrick in shock, and Lori was the first to react. She thought Patrick was joking. "Patrick, stop joking. You've been living abroad, and you two never know each other. Who said 2 people have to know each other before having sex?" Patrick said coldly. As he spoke, he looked around at everyone. He repeated in a cold voice, "Aunt Christina's carrying my baby. It is a fact. What did you say?" Mr. Hopkins finally reacted, amidst the immense shock, but he couldn't believe this reality. With a bang, Mr. Hopkins smashed the crutch in his hand, hard on the floor. "Patrick, explain to me," the old man warned coldly. In the corridor of the hospital, everyone around them was trembling with fear. It had been many years since Mr. Hopkins lost his temper. The butler at the side saw Mr. Hopkins so angry that he hurriedly stepped forward and said nervously, "Old master, take care of yourself. You are with high blood pressure." He added, "This must be a misunderstanding." Patrick pursed his lips and did not intend to say any more, and his eyes looked thoughtfully into the ward. On the hospital bed, Christina's face was pale, her eyes empty, and her mind in a mess. Lori looked at the meaningful looks shared by them, and her mind went blank. What? Patrick, you don't even care about me or the Hampton family at all. You. Lori was so angry. She turned to look at Mr. Hopkins. "Dad, look at him. He is absurd, Patrick. Christina is my daughter-in-law. How dare you? How dare you to sleep with her?" The rules in the Hopkins family were strict, and Mr. Hopkins had always been strict with his descendants, especially with Patrick. But now, Mr. Hopkins was so furious that he kept coughing and felt suffocating. The butler immediately walked over and patted his back to calm him down, and the bodyguards and servants who had followed him here were so frightened that they all held their breath. Lori cursed. "Dad, I know Patrick is your only grandson and the heir of the Hopkins family. Everyone dotes on him and favors him. You've been in a hurry to get him a wife, but now Lori shouted in the grievance. "Patrick slept with his cousin-in-law. Christina is Corey's wife. But Patrick took the advantage of his identity as young master of the Hopkins family to do such an immoral thing. How embarrassed Corey will be. How will others gossip about the Hampton family? Lori was so angry that she yelled at the ward, "You two are so shameless!" Lori's voice was shrill and loud, and in the ward, Christina's face turned pale. Her heart was hurt by those harsh curses. "Corey, what do you think that night at the hotel?" Patrick asked, in a cold voice, meaningfully. Everyone looked at Corey. Corey's face was extremely gloomy. When he heard the word hotel, he immediately remembered his plan. "Auntie, why don't you ask your son, why did he send Christina to my bed?" Patrick sneered and looked at Lori. Lori suddenly fell silent, in shock. Guilt flashed through Corey's eyes, but at the same time, he was angry. He retorted loudly, "I admit I wanted to divorce Christina, but I just wanted to take some pictures of her to threaten her. Even if I hated Christina, I couldn't really find a man to sleep with her and cuckolded myself." That night, he had only arranged for someone to drug Christina, take some photos, and humiliate her so he could threaten her to divorce. But how? How did this happen? How could she really sleep with another man, and the man who slept with her was Patrick? "Mr. Hopkins, I got the report." Suddenly, a doctor rushed over. The doctor respectfully handed him a paternity test report. The report used maternal vein blood as the sample for the paternity test, which was the latest genetic technology. It helped identify the father of a baby in the genetic term. No one dared to say anything. They looked at the report in the old man's hand with complicated eyes. Mr. Hopkins looked at the report and became silent. He raised his head and looked sharply at the woman in the ward. Christina was stared at by this respectable old man. Her face was pale, and she was clutching the sheet tightly. Her mind seemed to be blank, and she was in a state of unease. Why did it become like this? What should I do? What should I do? She thought. After a long while, Mr. Hopkins suddenly spoke in a deep voice. His voice was serious and stern. "Keep the baby." "What?" Lori listened in disbelief to her father's decision. Christina was Corey's wife. How could she be carrying Patrick's child? Christina must divorce Corey as soon as possible and then register a marriage with Patrick. Mr. Hopkins announced again. Patrick immediately rejected this request and angrily left the hospital. Yant, Christina came to a spacious master bedroom. She was upset as she looked around at the unfamiliar decor. She couldn't help but sigh. When they were in the hospital that day, Mr. Hopkins's words shocked everyone. She was asked to carry the child, divorce Corey, and then marry Patrick, but Patrick angrily left. So since being asked to move to the Hopkins family, 3 days had passed, and she hadn't seen Patrick once. Suddenly, someone came in from outside the door. An elder woman walked up to her with a kind smile. "Young madam, hello. My name is Nanny Feng. I will be in charge of your diet and daily life from now on. If you need anything, please tell me." Christina stared at Nanny Feng and looked embarrassed. She was not used to being called young madam. By people of the Hopkins family, Nanny Feng could see her reserve and smiled amiably. "Young madam, old master has already given the order and the Hopkins family is now busy preparing you and young master's wedding. We will do our best to take care of each detail of the wedding. During this time, all you need to do is look after the baby." Hearing that, Christina furrowed her brow. She wanted to break free from this puppet-like life, as if she had no say in her own life. She felt tossed around like a pawn by them. She needed to see Patrick immediately. She needed to discuss a deadline with him. She didn't want to be trapped in the cage of marriage anymore. Just like him. Most importantly, she would never believe in marriage again. "Excuse me, when will Patrick be back?" she asked Nanny Fang. She clearly saw Nanny Fang's expression become hesitant, but Fang still reassured her. Miss, he has been busy with overtime recently. I believe he will be back soon. Christina knew she wouldn't get any answers from her at this moment. It was late now, so she asked Nanny Fang to go rest. Young madam, have a rest first. There is a maid outside the door. You may ring the bedside bell if you need anything. Christina nodded at her. As Nanny left, Christina was about to start organizing her things when she opened a drawer and a pocket watch suddenly fell out. What is this? Christina remembered. This is the pocket watch in Patrick's pocket that night when I snatched his coat. I had given this to the taxi drivers for the fare. Why is it here? She looked at it carefully, lifted the lid of the pocket watch, and found a small picture embedded in it. The woman in the picture looked so familiar. What are you doing? Suddenly, a cold voice came from outside the door. Christina immediately hid the pocket watch behind her, as if she was guilty. She raised her head and saw Patrick stride towards her. Christina watched him approaching her and glaring at her. Yes, his eyes were fierce, as if something was making him angry. Give it to me. I am sorry. I didn't mean to. It must mean a lot to him since he took efforts to get the pocket watch back. But just as Christina was about to apologize, Patrick seemed impatient and quickly extended his right hand to grab her shoulder. Patrick tightened his grip and held her. She felt pain. He snatched the watch from her. Christina, do you really think that you will be my wife? Are you daydreaming? He sneered and said. He was standing right in front of her. His tall figure made her feel a bit scared. Christina raised her head and looked into his cold eyes. She was angry. You think I want to marry you? I don't. Stop pretending to be innocent. Is there a woman who doesn't want to marry into the Hopkins family? Christina, do you really think you are special? Patrick lowered his head and glared at the face in front of him. His eyes were deep with reminiscence. He seemed to be recalling something. They were so close that Christina felt uncomfortable. She struggled to push him away. Patrick, on the other hand, was suppressing the growing irritation in his heart. When his eyes fell on her bright red lips, he felt an inexplicable impulse. Without saying a word, he kissed her on the lips. A bit fiercely, Christina was stunned. There was a slight pain in her lips, and she tasted blood. Who does he think I am? Christina was panicked and angry. Let me go. She raised her right hand and swung it at the man in front of her. The moment she raised her hand, Patrick let go of her, as if her voice had broken his memories. Patrick held her wrist in midair at an extremely fast speed and looked at her face again with only an indifferent look in his eyes. Christina, remember why you are here. You are here because you have my child. This is just a deal. Don't talk to me about your so-called love. Don't say you will be loyal to some man. We are adults, and it is an adult's game. Even dignity is worthless. His voice was cold and clear. Christina's eyes welled up with tears, perhaps due to the hormones of pregnancy. She thought she wouldn't shed any more tears after Corey's betrayal, but when she was misunderstood again, she couldn't control her feelings of grievance. She angrily slapped Patrick. Don't think that just because you have money, you can define me however you want. If you are willing to propose a divorce to your grandfather, I will not hesitate to leave here. Patrick couldn't believe he had been slapped. He looked at the pained eyes of the woman. Although he wanted to kill her, she was carrying his child. He glared at her fiercely and then closed the door. Christina fell to the ground in pain. She knew that she and Patrick wouldn't get along well. She needed to find his grandfather and explain everything. At midnight, Fireworks Bar, the biggest and most luxurious bar in the city center, was bustling with people from rich families, and some famous movie stars and models often came to play up to them. There were loud music and dim lights. Occasionally, bright colorful beams of light flashed across the dance floor. Handsome men and beautiful women twisted their bodies to the rhythm of the music and fully indulged themselves. When a bright yellow light flashed across the bar's VIP entrance, a man walked in, slowly. Under the bright light, his figure was tall and straight. His face was cold, and his thin lips were slightly pursed. Looking cold and indifferent, "Mr. Hopkins, please follow me." The general manager of the bar waited at the entrance. They entered the elevator and went straight to the top floor of the bar. The bar on the top floor was much quieter, different from the one downstairs, which was very noisy. The bar occupied the entire top floor, and it was very spacious, simple, and exquisite, with expensive oil paintings hanging on the walls and antique vases and statues displayed in it. At the end of the east side was a place for famous wine, and in front of it was a semicircular bar counter. There were usually no waiters, and very few people could come here. Women are usually not allowed in here. "I only take you here today because you have promised me to straddle yourself over me when we have sex." Suddenly, there was a clink of glasses, followed by a man's giggle. "Mr. Shepherd, it is agreed that I am the female lead in the new movie. Don't forget it," the woman said coquettishly. Then she raised her glass to feed him with an ingratiating smile. But the director said, "You are not a good actor. What should we do? Mr. Shepherd, why don't you ask them to leave first?" The general manager of the bar walked over quickly and said something nervously to Charles. Charles was having a good time and glared at the general manager discontentedly. On the dark green sofa across the bar, another man suddenly chuckled. "Charles, you are going to die." "What?" Seeing Chandler's treacherous smile, Charles immediately raised his head vigilantly. When he looked up at the man in front of him, he immediately pushed the woman away from him. He jumped off the bar counter and pretended to be disgusted. "Get out, all of you!" Seeing Charles's attitude change so quickly, the movie stars and models turned around and looked behind them. Startled, "Mr. Hopkins!" They could not hide their adoration, and they called out coquettishly. However, Patrick was expressionless and looked coldly at Charles. Charles felt a shiver down his spine and was really desperate. All of his childhood friends knew that Patrick hated women for some reason. Charles hurriedly chased these women downstairs. He was relieved when he saw that Patrick was not angry. "Patrick, I heard that your grandfather forced you to get married today." Chandler poured Patrick a glass of red wine and asked with a faint smile. Before Patrick could say anything, Charles was the first to get excited. "What? Patrick, are you married?" Mr. Shepherd didn't believe it. Even if Mr. Hopkins forced him, it was basically useless. How could Patrick be so obedient? Not only that, but Patrick will soon have a child. Chandler continued teasingly, undeterred. Charles couldn't hide his shock. He was very curious about what made Patrick agree to marry the woman. Suddenly, Chandler remembered Christina's appearance, combined with the woman on Patrick's pocket watch. And he suddenly understood something. "Patrick, Christina looks like her." Patrick took a sip from his glass and held his watch tightly, but did not answer. Chandler looked at the pocket watch in his hand. They all knew that there was a picture of Cecilia, Patrick's ex-girlfriend, in his pocket watch. Christina really looked like Cecilia, who was already dead. Christina's sleep was restless. She remembered her life since her mother's death. She had always been envied by her peers, living in a very wealthy family, with parents who loved her deeply, until her mother was unable to conceive a son. She watched her mother try various methods to get pregnant, but they all ended in miscarriage. Her father's gaze towards her mother grew colder and colder until his mistress was brought into their home and her mother was framed and imprisoned. Her mother was falsely accused of killing her first child, who was ultimately confirmed to be a son. Her father refused to listen to any explanations from her mother and immediately reported her to the police. Her mother eventually despaired and took her own life in prison. No. Mom. Christina woke up from the nightmare. Sitting up immediately, she realized that her back was drenched in sweat. She would not let herself end up like her mother. When a man sees you only as a tool for reproduction, you should have the clarity to leave him. There was a knock on the bedroom door, and the nanny reminded her that Mr. Hopkins was waiting for her. When Christina arrived at the dining room, she saw Mr. Hopkins and Patrick had already sat down. They did not talk, but each held a newspaper in their hands. She didn't expect Patrick to be at home. She had initially planned to talk to Mr. Hopkins alone, intending to wait until Patrick left before discussing anything. The atmosphere was a little solemn. Christina glanced at the old man and thought for a while. "Good morning, Mr. Hopkins." She greeted him nervously. Although the old man was nearly 80 years old, his body was strong and his face was serious. When he heard Christina's greeting, he did not even raise his head, but just looked at the butler beside him. The butler immediately understood and quickly asked the servants to serve breakfast. He turned to Christina and smiled kindly. "Ma'am, please come over here." The butler signaled her to sit on Patrick's left. Christina nodded at the butler but hesitated. She didn't want to sit next to Patrick. Just then, Patrick raised his head and looked at her. Patrick's eyes were cold and indifferent as if he were looking at an irrelevant person. Then he put down the newspaper and ignored her. Christina had no choice but to sit reluctantly on his left. The servants quickly put breakfast on the table and prepared various food, including scallop porridge, paste, milk, and so on. Patrick and Mr. Hopkins did not speak during the meal. They ate gracefully and quietly. "Ma'am, you are pregnant now. The nutritionist has prepared a nutritious meal for you." The maid brought her a bowl of porridge. Christina didn't dare to be picky. She took a sip. It was bland and bitter and tasted terrible. Just as Mr. Hopkins's sharp eyes glanced at her, Christina immediately lowered her head nervously and obediently drank the bowl of medicinal porridge. Mr. Hopkins seemed to be satisfied with her obedient attitude. He had half a bowl of scallop porridge and put down the spoon. The butler hurriedly handed him a cup of warm water. Mr. Hopkins took a sip and gently wiped his lips with a napkin before he said in a deep voice, "Take care of yourself since you are pregnant." Although Christina felt uncomfortable with the orders from her elders, she still needed to respect their upbringing. She nodded in agreement. "Yes, I see. I said she is pregnant. There are many things you should pay attention to," Mr. Hopkins repeated, raising his voice in displeasure. Then, Christina suddenly realized that the old man was talking to Patrick. Patrick's expression was indifferent. He ate half of his paste, put down his fork, raised his eyebrows and looked at his grandfather. Then asked, "What should I pay attention to?" Mr. Hopkins's face darkened. In the early stages of pregnancy, there are some things you can't do. "Control yourself," the old man reminded Patrick angrily. When Patrick heard this, he looked at Christina with a meaningful look. Christina blushed. Mr. Hopkins got up from his chair. With a crutch in his right hand, he glanced at Christina and suddenly said, "Call me Grandpa in the future." Christina looked a little surprised. She was surprised that Mr. Hopkins accepted her so quickly because he knew she was Corey's wife and now pregnant with Patrick's child. According to reason, he should be very unhappy with her, but since coming to the Hopkins family, she has been well taken care of, except for Patrick's cold attitude towards her. Everyone else treats her as the mistress of the Hopkins family. She sighed. But even so, she didn't want to stay here any longer. After dinner, Patrick left the table without looking at her. She waited until Patrick's car had truly left before calling out to Mr. Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins glanced at her and immediately said unhappily, I just said you should call me Grandpa. Without waiting for Christina to express her thoughts, Mr. Hopkins quickly added, in the afternoon, the bridal shop will deliver some designs. You can choose the style you like. There is nothing else for you to do. You can go back to your room and rest. What? Christina gasped. She couldn't agree to have a wedding. She immediately said, Grandpa, I think Patrick and I should get a divorce. What are you saying? Mr. Hopkins's voice carried a heavy panting, and he looked very angry. Grandpa, as you have also noticed, Patrick doesn't want to accept me, but you are carrying a child of the Hopkins family. I absolutely won't allow a child of the Hopkins family to become a bastard. Especially if you take this child away, that is something that will never happen. I believe, with the Hopkins family's status in the city, you will never be able to do that. Christina bit her lip. Even though her own family was powerful, she wouldn't go to her father. But she still didn't want to compromise. What if I give birth to the child? Mr. Hopkins's face grew darker and darker. Patrick needed a marriage, especially an heir. He had to do it for him, whether he wanted to or not. Christina, I think it would be best if you didn't have any thoughts of leaving. Have you forgotten that your aunt is still lying in the hospital, needing a huge amount of medical expenses to support all of this? If you offend the Hopkins family, I don't think any company would dare to let you work for them. Mr. Hopkins issued his final ultimatum and left the dining room angrily before Christina could ask any more questions. Christina never expected that Mr. Hopkins would use her aunt to threaten her. Since her mother's death, her aunt was her only relative, and she couldn't give her up. Christina decided to go outside for some fresh air. Meanwhile, in the Hampton villa, the Mistress Laurie heard the news that Mr. Hopkins was really planning a wedding, and she immediately became unsettled. Her son couldn't become the outstanding person she thought he should be, so she had to plan everything for her son. She knew that it was difficult for women to establish themselves in the male-dominated business world, but she had done it. She became one of the most outstanding businesswomen in the country. She was completely disappointed in her son, and she hoped that her daughter-in-law would give birth to an heir. And her daughter-in-law had to be someone she personally chose. As soon as she saw Christina for the first time, she had her investigated. She was the famous heir of the Dickens family. But she was currently in conflict with the Dickens family. So she encouraged Corey to pursue Christina, but she didn't expect her son to defy her. He insisted on not sleeping with Christina and instead had a child with a nobody. She immediately rushed to the Hopkins family. What the hell is going on? Are they really going to have a wedding? So embarrassing. Not long after Christina left, Laurie rushed to Hopkins' family in a huff. Seeing the butlers and maids in Hopkins' family busy with Patrick and Christina's marriage, she became even angrier. Everyone in the circle knows that Christina used to be Hampton family's daughter-in-law, but now suddenly, Laurie's chest heaved with anger. This wedding will only bring shame to Hopkins' family and the Hampton family. No, this can't be. Besides, just let Christina give birth to the baby. There is no need to get marriage licenses. The butler looked at her and said slowly, the child of the Hopkins family, of course, won't be an illegitimate child. Besides, most importantly, Patrick agreed to marry her. Laurie's face was dark. She never thought that Patrick would agree to get marriage licenses with Christina. Seeing the anger on her face, the butler added in a low voice, Miss, you know the old man's temperament very well. Laurie did not stay in Hopkins' family for a long time. She knew that she could not disobey the old man's idea, so she had to start from other aspects. Contact the Dickens family in Sea City. Lori grabbed her phone and called her son. Corey. Corey heard her voice and asked impatiently, Mom, you are in the Hopkins family. What did Grandpa say, cousin and Christina? Lori was immediately furious. Your grandfather was biased towards your cousin. As soon as Patrick returned home, he became the president of the company, and he is always against me in the company. Patrick had never been interested in marriage, but now he agreed to get marriage certificates with Christina. I won't just let it go. Corey, did your mother call you just now? Carrie held his arm, and she noticed that he had been receiving calls from Lori over the past few days. Every time Corey answered the call, his expression was complicated and serious. Did your mother mention me and our daughter? They walked side by side into the largest shopping mall in the east of the city. Carrie nervously held his arm and said aggrievedly, It must have been Christina who spoke ill of me to your mother. Corey suddenly paused when hearing Christina's name. Corey, what exactly happened? Corey looked down at the little girl who was holding his left hand and took a deep breath. Nothing. He didn't want to say much in front of their daughter. He looked up at the elevator and said, Carrie, take our daughter for a walk. I'll wait for you in the smoking area. He looked very uneasy. Carrie had felt something was wrong with him and decided to ask him at night. With a smile on her face, she held him intimately. You should take Jasmine to the children's center on the 5th floor. Jasmine always wanted to play games with you. Carrie glanced at the little girl, who seemed to be very afraid of Carrie. Her small body shrank towards Corey, and her small hand tugged at the corner of his clothes. She immediately said in a low voice, Dad, I want to go to the children's center. Corey stroked his daughter's head and thought for a while. Then let's go to the 5th floor. A mid-age woman passed by, who looked at the girl and Corey, and said, Your husband and child are so pretty. Carrie's face was full of pride, and she called out to the two figures who had gone far away. Jasmine, don't let those beautiful ants get close to Dad. The little girl replied from afar, and nodded in fear. Carrie went to the clothes shops on the 2nd floor in a good mood. She went straight to an Italian brand for men's clothes. Has the suit I reserved for my husband ready yet? Carrie walked to the counter and proudly put a membership card on the table. How dare a mistress call another woman's husband in the public? Shameless. On the left side of the counter, a cold voice suddenly came. Christina was feeling down. She couldn't stop her wedding with Patrick. She had originally planned to go to the bookstore to read, but unexpectedly ran into Carrie. When enemies met, there would of course be battles. When Carrie heard the voice, she turned around and found Christina was also at this shop. Her face immediately turned sullen. Christina, who are you talking about? The sales clerk was afraid that they would fight in the store. She immediately walked over to Carrie and tried to calm her down. Miss Yi, the suit you ordered is ready. I'll take you to have a look. Carrie recently met many socialites in the upper class, thanks to Corey. She thought that she would be Mrs. Hampton in the future, so she couldn't ruin her reputation in this kind of shop. Wrap it up. Carrie glared at Christina angrily and laughed at her. She looked at Christina's cheap casual attire and bet that the Hopkins family hadn't accepted her. She immediately told the store clerk, saying, even though she dresses up beautifully, she doesn't have much money. It is impossible for the poor woman to buy any clothes. You'd better chase her out. Christina was biting her lips and holding back his anger, while the sales clerk glanced at her suspiciously, with some contempt in her eyes. Miss, please don't touch this suit. It belongs to Miss Yi. The shop was a membership-based shop. Although Christina was not a member, her nominal husband was. But when she saw the store clerk's snobbish gaze, she decided she wouldn't buy anything. She wouldn't allow Carrie to trample on her self-esteem like that. She looked at the pants beside her, and it seemed like Carrie knew what she was thinking. She immediately walked over, snatched the pants away, and hinted to her, "Be smart. Let go when you need to. There are things that don't belong to you that you'll never get." Christina looked at Carrie, who seemed to know nothing, and suddenly felt sorry for her. In fact, she had already divorced Corey, but it was clear that Corey hadn't told her. She bet that Corey was afraid his mother would cut off his credit card. With one hand holding the other end of the pants, Carrie must have been pleased, thinking she would get these pants. But Christina wouldn't let her have it her way. "Carrie, I won't allow you to be so proud," she sneered. Hiss. Sighed. With a sudden push, the expensive trousers in her hands were ripped open. "Ah, what are you doing?" the sales clerk screamed in shock. Carrie, who was standing opposite her, was furious, and she shouted, You, Christina, you deliberately went against me." With a cold face, Christina grabbed the expensive trousers and threw them at Carrie. "The defective products are most suitable for Corey. You can take it if you want." Carrie's face was covered by these torn trousers, and she was livid. "Miss, you are deliberately messing around." The manager of the shop rushed over and shouted at Christina with a serious face. Christina stood up straight and looked at the clerk. "What are you talking about? Indeed, I accidentally tore the trousers. But, did I say I won't pay for it? And I am your client too." She looked at the men's underwear next to her and calmly said, "I am here to buy my husband underpants." The store clerk looked at her from head to toe, seeing that she didn't have a single luxury item on her, and sneered. "Our store is members only. You know you don't have the qualifications to make a purchase." "Security." The store clerk immediately wanted to call security, and Carrie smirked as she watched, thinking Christina would embarrass herself. But Christina quickly pulled out a card and looked at the store clerk. "If I make a purchase of $1 million, can I become a member?" Upon hearing her words, the store clerk's eyes lit up, and she quickly nodded and said it was possible. "Give me all the men's underwear in the store." Christina immediately instructed the store clerk. Carrie's face turned even darker. She didn't believe that Christina could have so much money. Corey had told her that Christina was just an ordinary full-time housewife without a job. Now that Corey had kicked her out, where did she get the money from? She thought Christina was just buying time. But after the store clerk swiped for $1 million and immediately kicked Carrie out of the store, her face turned even darker. "What do you mean by not accepting my membership?" 5 minutes later, Carrie glared at the manager. "Do you know who I am? How dare you offend me? I am very sorry." The manager didn't explain but apologized formally. "You must make it clear to me today." Christina didn't know what was going on either. She looked at the famous model who had just walked over, then looked at Carrie and smiled. "Isn't that obvious? They don't want to sell you clothes. This isn't over." Carrie glared at Christina and turned around to warn the manager fiercely. "I am calling my husband down now." Christina was already disgusted enough by Carrie. She didn't want to see Corey, so she walked out of the mall with over 100 pairs of men's underwear. "Mrs. Hopkins, see you next time," the store clerk said obsequiously. Christina didn't originally want to spend Patrick's money, but thinking about how he had humiliated her last night, using his money to get revenge gave her a sense of satisfaction. Meanwhile, Patrick, who was on a business trip, furrowed his brow when he received a notification on his phone about a $1 million purchase at the mall. He was curious to know what that woman had bought. Carrie guessed something and was panicked. She quickly ran to the 5th floor to Corey. "I just met Christina. Someone called her Mrs. Hopkins." "What does that mean?" Corey's face darkened instantly. He was playing games with his daughter in his arms, Now he put her back on the ground. With a troubled face, he strode to the window, lit his cigarette, and took a few puffs. He frowned, blew out a stream of smoke, and said angrily, "Christina has already gotten a marriage license with my cousin." Christina was his cousin's wife now, and the thought of it made Corey even more upset. Carrie's eyes widened in shock. Christina had married into the Hopkins family. Christina was in a bad mood. As soon as she returned to the Hopkins family, she was told by a servant that Mr. Hopkins wanted to see her. She remembered the unpleasant conversation she had with Mr. Hopkins in the morning, and her mood immediately became downcast. She didn't want to see anyone from the Hopkins family now, but she had to abide by the rules of the Hopkins family, for the sake of her aunt. As soon as he entered the main hall of the Hopkins family's residence, he heard a deep voice. "That bastard got married to that woman, and he just left her here. Sir, the young master has gone to Berlin on a business trip. I heard he will be back tomorrow. He was relaxed. He went on a business trip as soon as he got his license." Mr. Hopkins grunted angrily. "His aunts come to see me every day. They are so annoying." "Master, it is good that the young master cares about his wife." The butler made him tea and said, "In the past, they were worried that Patrick would never get married. Fortunately, he agreed to marry Christina." When Mr. Hopkins heard this, his face immediately darkened. "All these years, I've been urging him to get married and have set up so many famous ladies for him. He just likes that dead ex-girlfriend, Cecilia. If Christina didn't look like Cecilia, I think he would never get married. And there will be no offspring of the Hopkins family." Mr. Hopkins cursed angrily, but at this moment, Christina was frozen by the door. She didn't mean to eavesdrop on these secrets. She was panicking, and her phone fell onto the floor. Mr. Hopkins and the butler heard the voice and turned to look. Mr. Hopkins glanced at her, and it seemed he didn't mind her overhearing. He told her in a dignified voice, "You should avoid using smartphones too much since you are pregnant." And he looked at the cell phone that had fallen on the floor. Christina quickly picked up the phone. "I see," she replied obediently. "Ma'am, it is nearing the new year. We've arranged your wedding after the new year, because you are pregnant and shouldn't walk a lot. The wedding will be simple. We'll only entertain some important guests. After the baby is born, we'll hold another grand banquet for the baby's first-month birthday." The old butler told her about the wedding. Okay. Christina followed their arrangements, and she thought after the baby was born, she probably had have left Hopkins' family. But as the new year approached, Christina remembered something else. She thought her aunt might have already returned to the apartment. "About your aunt." The old butler seemed to have guessed what she was thinking about and said in a deep voice, his eyes fixed on her with a look, "Your Aunt Betty has a heart attack. We've already sent someone to contact the hospital and are actively looking for a suitable source of heart." When Christina heard this, she was stunned, and her eyes turned red. What she had been most worried about was her aunt's illness, which had worsened over the past few years. But she had nothing to do but watch her relatives become increasingly haggard and thin. "Thank you." She lowered her head and said in a choked voice. She never thought that Mr. Hopkins would be willing to help her aunt. If he could really save her aunt's life, she could do anything for him. Christina looked up at Mr. Hopkins, sitting on the sofa again, and asked carefully, "Grandpa, can I go back?" Mr. Hopkins looked at her in a dignified manner and narrowed his eyes. He did not answer. Instead, he turned his head and ignored her. Christina was a little anxious when she saw that the venerable old man ignored her. "We will not confine your freedom," said the old butler kindly. Then, the butler ordered a maid outside the door to call the driver to take her back to the small apartment. In the old district, Christina cast a grateful glance at the old butler and respectfully said to Mr. Hopkins, "Grandpa, I'll go back very soon." Christina's footsteps were stiff, and she followed the maid to the door. "Do I look so terrifying?" Just as Christina walked out of the door, Mr. Hopkins asked with dissatisfaction in a deep voice, "Is she afraid of me?" The old butler could not help but laugh. "Old master, except young master, everyone is afraid of you." Even the top businessmen respected and feared the old master and Hopkins family. Besides, Christina was just a woman. Well, the old master and young master of the Hopkins family had the same temperament and were unapproachable. "Old master, you seem to like Christina very much." "Who said I liked her?" Mr. Hopkins's expression was complicated, and he glared at the butler. "I just think Christina is better than Cecilia." The old butler chuckled and said nothing. Christina was sent to her own apartment by a driver from the Hopkins family. "Can you stop here? I'll go into the compound myself." Christina suddenly spoke to the driver. She knew that a Hopkins family's luxurious car would definitely provoke gossip from the neighbors. She didn't like the glare of publicity. "Yes, young madam, I'll wait for you here. Please be careful." The driver agreed and reminded her to be careful. After all, she was pregnant with a child of the Hopkins family. If anything happened to her, no one could afford the consequence. Christina nodded at him, opened the door, and walked out. The 5-story old apartment building didn't have an elevator, and even the streetlights didn't work. Because it was in the old district and far from the city center, the rent was relatively low. She finally reached the 5th floor and took out the key to open the door, only to see that the door had been opened. Christina was happy. She thought her aunt probably had come back from the sanatorium. "Auntie, are you back?" She pushed the door open and walked in quickly. However, as soon as she entered, she saw a man standing in the small living room. Christina looked at the man and put on a long face. "Corey, why are you here?" Christina's voice was full of disgust. Corey looked at her but did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked at her with a strange look. He didn't know that Christina and her aunt were living in such a small and dilapidated apartment, which was worse than the servant's room at his place. During the 3 years that Christina married him, she never asked for money from him. Suddenly, Corey felt that he had never really taken her seriously. In fact, Christina was 1.68 meters tall and was as exquisite as a famous model. Her face was white and delicate, and she was more beautiful than Carrie. "Corey, you are not welcome here." Christina felt disgusted when he looked at her, and she said in a cold voice, "Give me the key." She knew that this key was given to him by her aunt. "Christina, when your aunt gave me the key, she asked me to take good care of you." Corey looked at her with more affections. "Corey, don't pretend that you care about me." Christina didn't want to see him, so she rebuked him. "Get out. This place is too shabby for you, Mr. Hampton." Corey felt guilty when she scolded him. All these years, he was used to her obedience. It was a complicated feeling for him to hear her cold voice. It suddenly occurred to him that she had married his cousin, and the feeling in his heart grew even more indescribable. "You are sarcastic to me because you married my cousin, aren't you?" Corey was jealous. "Why do you think my cousin wants to marry you? You really think that you've become upper class, don't you? Patrick has just taken over the company. He is competing with my mother and the others for power. You are just a pawn of him. After you give birth to the child, he'll kick you out. You'll be nothing but a laughing stock by then." Christina held back, gritting her teeth and scolding, "That is enough. Get out of here." She couldn't stand it any longer, and took a step forward. She reached out and quickly grabbed his right arm, snatching the key from his hand. Just as Christina was about to push him out of the room, Corey held her in his arms. Christina, I know you are mad at me, but I am doing it for your own good. I'll give you 3 million. With that, you and your aunt can leave here and live a better life somewhere else. Christina was held tightly by him and had a hard time struggling to break free of him. Suddenly, there was an urgent sound of footsteps outside the door. Why are you hugging each other? Carrie's shrill voice came, and she nervously grabbed Corey's arm and separated them. She was anxious when she noticed that Corey's gaze was fixing on Christina. Holding his arm, she urged, Corey, didn't you say you prepared 3 million for her to leave? She is so poor. She must need the money. With that, Carrie took out a check from Corey's wallet and threw it on the table proudly. Christina glanced at the check on the table and sneered, Carrie, no matter how poor I am better than an ungrateful bitch like you. Corey heard her scolding Carrie and subconsciously helped the latter. Christina, come at me and don't target Carrie. Carrie is a good woman. It was she who asked me to give you the money. She is very tolerant of you. Christina grabbed the check and said, Corey, do you want to pay me off? Then she tore the check into pieces and scattered them to the ground. Do you know why I hate her? Corey, you know nothing. It has been 3 years and you don't know anything about me. You never care about me. Corey, you've always been disdainful to know me, haven't you? Well, I'll tell you now. I am the real me now, she scolded in a cold voice. As soon as Christina finished speaking, she suddenly turned around, her back against his chest, her hands clutching his front collar and his belt. Moving swiftly, she turned her right foot back and threw herself forward. With a force, she threw the man over her shoulder heavily in a karate move. Bang! Corey, I am not as stupid as I used to be. You'd better not provoke me again. He fell out in the air. He was shocked when his back hurt from the collision, and he looked up at her. Bang! Christina slammed the door and chased the scum couple out. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she tried to hold back the sadness in her heart. She had to admit that she felt really sorrowful. She used to love this man with all her might. She didn't regret it. She just hated that she didn't see him clearly back then. Christina looked at the dilapidated little apartment in a daze. She closed her eyes and tried to calm herself down. She tried to walk towards the wooden chair on the left, but suddenly there was a sharp pain in her ankle. Christina frowned and stepped over to the chair to sit down. She had just thrown that scum Corey over her shoulder and used so much force that she accidentally sprained her ankle. She bent down and was about to pull up her pants to check her ankle. At this moment, footsteps suddenly came from outside the door. Christina's first thought was that Corey was not afraid of death and dared to come back to provoke her again. Then she thought it was impossible because she beat him so much that he could only go to the hospital. Perhaps it was the driver from Hopkins' family who came up to look for her. At the thought of this, her face softened, and she turned to look at the door with a smile. But as soon as she looked up, her smile froze. Christina's eyes widened slightly as she looked at the man who suddenly appeared. Didn't he come back tomorrow after a business trip? Why was he here? Patrick suddenly appeared in the small old apartment, and he looked around. His face was grim, and he didn't say a word, but just walked straight towards her. Christina looked at his unfriendly face as if he had come to seek revenge. She didn't offend him before. You came to see me. There was a little uncertain in her tone. What is going on? Patrick did not answer, but asked in a cold and deep voice. Christina did not understand what he was asking for a moment. She sat on a wooden chair while Patrick stood. He was already 1.85 meters tall, and now he looked down on her from above. She was a little nervous. Christina didn't want to be looked down upon like this, so she stood up subconsciously and explained. Grandpa agreed to let me out. But Patrick didn't wait for her to finish. With a cold face, he suddenly took a big step and said, "Sit down." Christina leaned back in fear and slumped back into the chair. "Take off your clothes." He squatted down, looked her in the eye, and suddenly ordered in a cold voice. Christina panicked and quickly protected her chest with her hands. "What are you doing?" But Patrick seemed to lose her patience with a gloomy face. He reached out his hands to pull her clothes. He was so strong that Christina's coat was quickly pulled down by him. "Patrick, although I want you to help me with something, you can't force me to." She defended and lashed out at him. "Shut up." With a roar of rage, he tore at her shirt with both hands, and then the sound of buttons falling to the ground came. Her bare skin was slightly cold in the air, and Patrick pulled her shirt off with his big palm. Christina felt humiliated and embarrassed. She raised her hand and tried to fight back. "Ah, it hurts." But just as Christina raised her right hand, she felt a burning pain. "Don't move." Patrick pressed her shoulders and stared at her with deep, warning eyes. Christina felt a little guilty when he looked at her. She glanced at her right arm from the corner of her eye and saw some blood oozing out of her white shirt. It must hurt when she had thrown Corey over her shoulder. She used too much strength, so her old wound was bleeding. His large palm caressed the wound on her arm, which was cut by glass shards in Hopkins' family a week ago and stitched. But the wound was so deep that it was difficult to heal. This time, it was bleeding again. The dark red blood slid down her fair arms, which was a little frightening. "Where is the medicine box?" Patrick asked in a cold voice. Christina didn't dare to move. He pointed at an old cabinet opposite him. "It is over there." Patrick stood up straight and glanced at her, warning her not to move. Christina looked down and blushed at his eyes. She knew he was looking for a medicine box to stop the bleeding, but now that she was stripped bare by him, her upper body was left with a bra, so she was really embarrassed to face him. Patrick really didn't have a trooper desire. He took gauze and hydrogen peroxide from the small medicine KT and put bandages on her. As the wound was a little deep, Christina couldn't help but frown when he applied the hydrogen peroxide to her wound. Patrick glanced at her. He remained cold and did not speak, but he became much more gentle. Finally, Patrick turned around to pack the medicine kit, and Christina immediately put her shirt back on. When Patrick put everything in order and looked back at her, she had already put on her coat and looked at him nervously. "Thanks you," Christina said stiffly. Patrick ignored her. Instead, he looked at her for a while, as if he was thinking about something. "Go back," he suddenly said, and walked towards the door. But Christina did not follow him. When Patrick got to the door, he looked back at her with some dissatisfaction, and he repeated, "Go back to the Hopkins family." Christina sat on the wooden chair with a strange and complicated expression. "Ugh. I have to wait for my aunt to come back. T has something to tell her." She sat in the chair and was a little reluctant to move. "Your aunt has been trying some new medicine recently. She is still in the sanatorium and can't come back for the time being," Patrick told her in a cold voice. Christina was a little surprised that he even knew this. Without an excuse, she glanced down at her ankle. Christina bit her lips tightly, braced herself, and stood up. She moved unwilling toward him. Patrick seemed to be thinking about something else. When he saw her coming, he did not pay much attention to her. The two of them walked, one in front and the other in the back, since there was no elevator in this old apartment building. Christine had to walk down the stairs from the 5th floor. Christina felt a sharp pain in her ankle with every step she took. She endured it and her face turned pale. Patrick walked faster than her as he had long legs. When he walked out of the apartment building, he turned around and saw no sign of Christina. He frowned slightly and stood there, looking impatiently up the stairs. Patrick was stunned when he raised his head. With a gloomy expression, he took 2 flights of steps at a time. He saw her sitting on the steps at the corner of the 2nd floor. "Are you dumb? Why don't you tell me your feet hurt?" His cold voice was clearly filled with anger. Christina's feet hurt so much, and she felt wrong for some reason when he yelled at her. Why could he scold her? "It is none of your business." Patrick's face clouded over. He looked impatiently at her stubborn expression and bent down to pick her up. Christina was very uncomfortable when she was suddenly hugged by him. Subconsciously, she struggled, "Put me down. I can walk on my own." "Walk on your own." Patrick repeated it. He looked straight at her with his cold eyes. He seemed to have been completely angered and stopped in his tracks. Patrick did put her down, and Christina leaned against the rusty railing of the apartment on the right. Patrick stood beside her and looked at her as if he were watching a play. He urged coldly, "Go down, Christina, go down on your own now." Christina felt a little timid, panicked, and wronged when she heard his gloomy voice. She was so stubborn that she glared back at him, bit her lips, stretched out her left foot, and took a step. She couldn't let him look down on her. She must walk on her own. In fact, her right ankle was already sprained. After walking down from the 5th floor, her ankles were bruised and swollen. When she stretched her left foot out, her right foot was too weak to support her. She lost her balance and fell forward. With an ouch, her knee hit the floor. Christina quickly grabbed the handrail on the right side of the staircase. She was not seriously injured, but she looked very awkward. "Stand up. I tell you to stand up now. You said you can walk down on your own. So do it." Patrick stood looking at her without the slightest intention of offering help. Instead, he continued to urge her with his cold voice. Christina wanted to cry when she heard his cold voice. She squatted down and had no strength to stand up again. Her right ankle was throbbing with pain. She lowered her head, clutched the handrail of the stairs tightly with both hands, and endured it. She really wanted to prove to him that she could stand up on her own. But it really hurt. "I am Sony," she choked and said. Patrick's gaze deepened as he looked at her. "What did you say? Speak louder," he shouted in a cold and stern voice. "I am Sony." Christina raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes were filled with stubbornness, but she could only give in. Patrick looked into her eyes and felt pity for her. For some reason, he warned her coldly, "You'd better behave yourself in the future." He took a step forward and picked her up. This time, Christina did not struggle, but her whole body tensed up when he held her down the stairs. Patrick's chest was broad and firm. She curled up in his arms, not daring to move. She could feel his strong heartbeat and his unique cold and thin breath. This man was really difficult to get along with. Young Master. Outside the apartment, the driver of the Hopkins family was about to go upstairs to look for Christina. When he saw Patrick carrying her out, he was surprised. "Open the door," Patrick ordered, in a cold voice. Christina was put into the car by Patrick, and her expression was very awkward. They were so close to each other when he bent down to fasten her seatbelt, which made Christina embarrassed, and she twisted her body subconsciously. "Christina!" Patrick's face clouded over, and he immediately raised his head. He called out her name angrily, with warning in his deep voice. Christina froze and instinctively dared not move again. She didn't know why. She suddenly blushed when this man called her name. "Send her back to the Hopkins family and ask the steward to look after her foot," Patrick ordered the driver coldly. Then he slammed the door hard and looked at the woman in the car with an ambiguous look. "I don't want too many a cripple." Christina was taught a lesson by him and pursed her lips, not daring to refute. Christina's car drove away at a steady and high speed. Patrick stood there, looking thoughtfully at the disappearing car. "Patrick, do you cripple her in a fit of anger when you go catch adultery in the act?" Suddenly, in the other direction, Charles walked over with a smile on his face. He was surprised when he saw Patrick come down with the woman in his arms. When did Patrick learn to cherish a woman? "How is the photo going?" Patrick ignored his teasing and asked sternly. Charles didn't dare to continue to tease Patrick when he saw his expression. He said truthfully, "Nothing. It is from an unidentified number." As Charles spoke, he looked down at the screen of Patrick's phone. A photo was displayed on his phone screen. It was taken from a special angle, and in the photo, a man and a woman were cuddling. They were Christina and Corey. Charles pointed to a monitor above the apartment building. "The monitor got some pictures. Corey did come here before you received the photo, but they couldn't hug each other as they did in the photo," said Charles. Then he suddenly turned to look at Patrick opposite him with a sinister smile. "Because your cousin Corey didn't walk out on his own, but was carried out." Patrick's grim face froze when he heard this. Charles laughed even more wildly. "I can't believe that a big man like Corey could be thrown to the ground and ended up in hospital. Christina is so strong." Patrick had an imperceptible smile in his eyes, and he appeared to be cold. He turned around and got into the car. Find out the relationship between Carrie and Christina. He leaned against the back of the car and said faintly, half closing his eyes in drowsiness. Charles was a little surprised. Patrick really cared about Christina. However, Charles sympathized with Christina and muttered, "She must have been scared by you just now." Just now, when Patrick went to catch the adultery with a gloomy face, he really looked scary. Scare her? Patrick suddenly opened his eyes, and his face clouded over. He remembered how Christina was trying to be strong after her foot injury. He was angry. "You said I scared her." Charles was shocked. He didn't know what was wrong with Patrick, but he felt like Patrick was sulking, who pissed him off. "I was scared to death." Just now, Christina was sent back by a driver from the Hopkins family. As soon as the car stopped, she couldn't help but touch her chest and sighed. Just now, Patrick seemed very angry and said he didn't want to marry a cripple. Christina thought about it and immediately became worried. Patrick is really difficult to get along with. When Paul heard that she hurt her ankle, he called a doctor. Christina was helped into a wheelchair by a maid. "Ma'am, we agree to let you go out, but you should pay more attention to safety when you are pregnant, especially in the first 3 months of pregnancy. If you miscarry, all of us will be punished." It was the first time the steward had lectured her in such a serious voice. "It won't happen anymore." Christina lowered her head and replied apologetically. It was her first pregnancy, and she didn't know much about these things. Besides, she was so angry with Corey and Carrie that she didn't think so much. Seeing her like this, the steward did not say anything to teach her a lesson. After the doctor treated the cuts on her ankles and arms carefully, the maid sent her back to her bedroom to rest. At dinner time, the steward sent food directly to her bedroom. Christina, the disabled woman, was lying on the bed and could not go anywhere. Sitting in bed for a long time made her ass numb, and she couldn't fall asleep as it was too early. In addition, since Patrick had returned from a business trip, he might come back tonight. Christina was instantly on the alert, and she looked at the door from time to time. She wondered if Patrick would scold her when he came back later. "He won't sleep in this room, and he seems to despise me." Christina sat on the bed and thought nervously. Suddenly, her phone rang,